Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about an amazing U-turn that Donald Trump has now done on his reciprocal tariffs. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that Donald Trump has been very vocal on his Truth social media platform, and that platform is basically his equivalent of X. And the reason why he set it up was because back in the day, he was banned from X. Well, back in the days when it was still called Twitter and everybody was tweeting, but we've given up calling them tweets now, they're now posts. And he's now exclusively publishing lots of really exciting information directly to everybody through the Truth social media platform. And on the 9th of April, one of the biggest posts that he made was saying that he was going to impose an immediate 125% tariff on all imports from China. And this was later clarified to be on top of the 20% that was already in place as a result of the fact that China was accused of producing the majority of the fentanyl drug that's such a problem in the USA at the moment. Now, also in that post, he went on to say that he'd authorised a 90-day pause and a substantially lowered reciprocal tariff during this 90-day period of 10% effective immediately. However, it's now been announced that the 125% tariff against Chinese imports, and let's not forget it was all Chinese imports, has now been waived for a variety of different categories. This press release was issued on the 11th of April by US Customs and Border Protection and says, in accordance with the April 11, 2025 Presidential Memorandum Clarification of Exceptions under Executive Order 14257 of April 2nd, 2025 as amended, the memorandum, products properly classified in the headings and subheadings of the Harmonized Tariff Schedule of the United States listed in the memorandum are reproduced below. All products that are properly classified in these listed provisions will be excluded from the reciprocal tariffs imposed under Executive Order 14257 as amended, pursuant to Section 3B4 of that order, effective for merchandise entered for consumption or withdrawal from warehouse for consumption on or after 12:01 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time on April the 5th, 2025. And then we've got a whole list of different numbers. So we've got a bullet point, and then it's 8471, 8473.30, and so on. So does anybody understand what that means? Is that clear to everybody? Do you now know exactly what we're talking about in terms of lifting these reciprocal tariffs? Well, of course not. This is real jargon. This is a detailed set of numbers relating to classifications of products in terms of the import tariff being applied against them. Now, interestingly, there isn't any post on Truth Social by Donald Trump about this. He isn't declaring that some of the imports that previously were subject to these new reciprocal tariffs are now exempt. And the reason why he's doing this is because this relates to a huge amount of imports that are coming from China and lots of other countries. So basically what we're seeing here is the 125% tariff that's been announced against China, punishing them for all of the bad things that they've been doing to the USA over the past few years, have now been waived. This table, which I've put together using those product codes, shows the top 10 product categories that are now exempt from all of the reciprocal tariffs. So that's the 125% tariff applied to Chinese goods, and also the 10% tariff that's now in place as a result of the 90-day moratorium. So what you can see here is the biggest category is smartphones, which includes mobile phones, iPhones and Android devices. And in 2024, the total value of all of those imported into the USA was around $100 billion. And you can see that the main countries that the US was importing from are China, Vietnam, and South Korea. The second biggest category is computers and laptops, which equated to around $90 billion worth of imports in 2024. And you can see that once again, the biggest country that they're importing from is China, followed by Mexico and Taiwan. And Mexico have this 25% tariff in place. The third biggest category is semiconductor devices, which equated to around $80 billion worth of imports. And they came from Taiwan, South Korea, and China in that order. Memory chips came in at number 4 with a total value of around $60 billion, and they're coming from South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan. Flat panel displays equated to around $50 billion worth of imports from China, South Korea, and Vietnam. Tablets and smartwatches, so another category similar to smartphones, so consumer wearables and products, equated to $45 billion worth of imports from China, Vietnam, and India. Routers and networking equipment equated to a whopping $40 billion worth of imports. You wouldn't really think about that. It's not a category I think a lot of people think about. And they came from China, Taiwan, and Mexico, some of the highest tariffs that have been announced as part of the reciprocal tariffs. Disk drives and data storage devices equated to $35 billion, coming from Thailand, China, and Malaysia. Semiconductor manufacturing equipment equated to $30 billion, came from Japan, Netherlands, and Germany. And solar cells, around $25 billion worth of imports from China, Malaysia, and Vietnam. So once again, all of these are now completely exempt from the reciprocal tariffs. And if you add up all of the figures on the screen here, it comes to more than $550 billion. So that's $500 billion. And this is only the top 10 categories. There's actually 20 categories here. So we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of imports that previously Donald Trump was saying were now subject to all of these reciprocal tariffs because China and everybody else have been ripping off the USA for a long period of time, and he wants to equalize everything out. But what we're seeing here is that a large chunk of those tariffs have actually been waived. They're not applying at all. Now, in terms of answering the question why this action has been taken, we've talked about it a lot on the channel, but clearly the implication of all of these tariffs was that prices were going to go up for consumers and lots of American businesses were going to suffer.
Analysts predicted that the price of a top-end Apple iPhone could jump to $2,300 from $1,599 with a 54% tariff rate.
Now, that $2,300 estimation was on the 54% tariff, which was the start of the ramping up. Obviously, the tariff is now 125%, which is more than double, 54%. So I don't know where the estimated price would have come in, but it probably would have been closer to $3,000 for Apple. And we'll go on to talk about Apple in a bit more detail in a moment, because let's not forget that this was one of the largest companies in the USA up until recently in terms of its market capitalization. So a really important business for the US.
Trump's action also excludes the specified electronics from his 10% baseline tariffs on goods from most other countries, easing import costs for semiconductors from Taiwan and Apple iPhones produced in India. The president's 20% duties on all Chinese imports, which he said were related to the U.S. fentanyl crisis, remain in place.
So as I said earlier, the 20% tariff with regards to the drug problem, the fentanyl problem, is still remaining in place. So that will apply to all Chinese imports. But the 10% has been waived for every other country in the world that was currently under that.
White House spokesperson Carolyn Leavitt said in a separate statement that Trump has made it clear the U.S. cannot rely on China to manufacture critical technologies such as semiconductors, chips, smartphones, and laptops. She added that at Trump's direction, major tech firms including Apple and chip makers NVIDIA and Taiwan Semiconductor, quote, are hustling to onshore their manufacturing in the United States as soon as possible.
Now, this is a point that we've talked about before. The fact that the USA can't just magic up manufacturing facilities overnight. If you impose an immediate tariff, which is impacting on all of those imports, you need to have an alternative. And the US is looking to try to create jobs and bring everything back onshore, but that's going to take a long period of time, particularly when you're talking about a high-tech industry such as chip manufacturing. When we're talking about NVIDIA, it's the most advanced company in the world in terms of chip manufacture. You're not going to be able to set up a new facility within 6 weeks or 12 weeks. It's going to take a long period of time. And also, it's going to take a huge amount of investment, because setting up that sort of kit to produce high volumes needs a lot of investment. So NVIDIA and all of these companies may have the desire to do it, but it's going to have a really detrimental impact on their balance sheets and their cash flow, because they've already got facilities elsewhere in the world. And if the US is now saying, well, you need to move all of these back on shore, it's going to really damage their profitability.
The exemptions suggest an increased awareness within the Trump administration of the pain that his tariffs had in store for inflation weary consumers, especially on popular products like smartphones.
So, what we're hearing here is that the reality of the situation is now kicking in. So, it's one thing to announce all of these tariffs and say we're breaking our relationship with China, but the day to day implication of that is going to be really damaging, particularly for US consumers, because they are definitely going to see an increase in the price of anything that's imported. And that's the reason why these reciprocal tariffs have now been waived on the quiet. Now, I wanted to talk about Apple because, as I said, it was one of the biggest companies, it was actually the biggest company in the USA up until recently. And if we have a look at what the impact of the announcement of the tariffs has been on the share price, you can see that there was a complete crash after these tariffs were announced. The share price fell from more than $220 per share to less than 180, and that wiped off around $700 billion from the market cap for Apple. And it was reported in the press that Apple was on the brink of crisis before these new concessions were announced. Now, in terms of where Apple gets all of its profits from, you can see that the biggest source of sales by far is the iPhone, representing over 55% of all of Apple's revenue. It's its landmark product. It's the one thing that you think about when you think about Apple. Now, in terms of the impact of these tariffs on Apple and those iPhone sales, this table shows the global sales for Apple iPhones in 2024. So you can see that the biggest single market is the United States, where it sold just under 77 million units at an average price of around $950, giving a total estimated income of around $73 billion. However, if you take a step back and have a look at the rest of this table, you can see that actually the rest of the world is a much bigger market for Apple than the USA. Europe is the second biggest region, where it sold over 57 million phones at an average price of $900, bringing in $51.5 billion of revenue. China, interestingly, was the third biggest market, and Apple sold just under 45 million units at an average price of $870. So not that much lower than it was selling for in the United States. And that brought in total revenue of just under $39 billion. And I think that revenue could be in question in terms of what happens in the trading relationship between the USA and China, because China could decide that it wants to either ban the iPhone or introduce an investigation, which it does quite frequently for companies, and that would have a massive negative impact on Apple. India was the fourth biggest market for iPhone sales, where it sold 20 million units at an average price of $800, giving $16 billion worth of revenue, followed by Japan, where it sold 15.6 million units, the rest of Asia, 14.3, the Middle East and Africa, 10.3 million units, Canada, Apple sold 10 million iPhones, the United Kingdom 8 million, and Germany 7 million. So once again, the point that I'm making here is that Apple is actually a global business. This is a massive company that most of the revenue comes from outside of the United States. So the protectionist policy whereby all of the imports and all of the products and components are going to increase in price would have had a massively damaging impact on Apple iPhone sales. But also there could have been some action taken by a lot of these countries if they decided that they wanted to introduce a let's not buy American type mentality. Now, in terms of where Apple is producing the iPhones, I thought this table was really interesting because 70% of the production for iPhones is coming from China. So that is a huge amount. And the 145% tariff that was announced against Chinese imports would have impacted on a lot of those products because China is producing the majority of those iPhones, so some of them would have been going to the USA. Now, obviously, Apple can change where it's sourcing its products from, so it could look to India, where it has actually air freighted around 1.5 million phones recently to try to feed the US market and then divert a lot of the Chinese production to some of its other markets. But it simply won't get away from the fact that some of those products will definitely be going to the USA, certainly at the moment, before it has to change the way it's doing things. And so it would have had a massively damaging impact on Apple's sales price and also profitability. And this, as I said, was one of the biggest companies in the USA up until recently. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think the announcement that the USA has now waived hundreds of billions of dollars worth of reciprocal tariffs is really quite interesting. Firstly, it's an acknowledgement that these tariffs will be very damaging to the US economy because lots of American businesses are going to suffer. We talked about Apple in detail in terms of it sourcing the majority of its iPhone products from China. And so that 145% tariff would have devastated that business, potentially could have put Apple out of business in terms of having to raise the sales price to closer to $3,000. So that simply wasn't going to work from Apple's point of view. But alongside Apple, there are thousands and thousands of other US businesses that source lots of vital components and parts and raw materials from China. And all of those businesses are going to be really badly affected. So the fact that the announcement has now waived all of these tariffs with regards to the 20 product categories that they were published, I went through 10 of them in detail, and a lot of them are high-tech products because, as we've discussed before, a lot of these high-tech products have migrated to China because they're labor intensive. They've got people on production lines who are soldering small items, and it's quite a laborious process. And the cost of labor in China is much cheaper than it is in the USA. And also, China have built these mega factories. So the Chinese authorities have been funding those over the past 30 years. They wanted to become the world's manufacturing base. So they have these enormous manufacturing facilities. In fact, a lot of the workers actually go and live there during, well, 11 months of the year. They go home during the New Year period, but people actually live on site. So they'll work a long shift and then they'll go to the bed, and you'll have some hot bedding where people may be switching beds over, all that type of thing. So this is a completely different setup to what you've got in the USA, and the cost base for it is significantly lower. So that's one of the reasons why Apple and lots of other big US businesses have been outsourcing that production to China. The fact that they've now got to change where they're sourcing these items from will have an impact on their costs going forward. So we saw in the video earlier that Nvidia and lots of other companies are now considering moving all of their production back to the USA. But that's going to involve a huge amount of investment. We're talking billions of dollars, probably tens or even hundreds of billions of dollars cumulatively. It's also going to take a long period of time because you can't set up those sort of facilities in a couple of months. It's not like setting up a warehouse where you can just bosh it up and off you go. These are really high-tech production lines, and the quality is really important. And obviously, if you're producing volume, you need the sites to be able to do this. So they've got to find somewhere to do it. Then they've got to pay to build the facilities. Then they've got to hire all of the people to work in them. And lots of people have sent me comments recently saying, stop talking about labor because everything will be automated. It'll all be done by robots. Well, somebody's going to have to pay for those robots. And if it is all done by robots, that's actually not going to achieve the goal of creating employment. It will mean that things are made in the USA, so China won't get the revenue, but it doesn't actually help in terms of giving more jobs out to people. So I don't think everything will be done by robots. I think you do need people to do certain things, but it's going to take time to build those facilities and then find the people to work in them and then get them operational. We're talking probably years to be able to do this, not weeks. Probably not months for a lot of these companies. And also, who's going to fund it? Where's the money going to come from? Because Nvidia and Apple and all of those companies don't just have tens of billions of dollars kicking around that they don't know what to do with. They're going to need to raise that capital. So the US government might need to get involved, might need to start giving huge amounts of cash to all of these businesses in the same way, perversely, as China has been doing over the past 30 years to fund some of its mega factories. But the overall summary of today's video is that we've now seen a U-turn in terms of the reciprocal tariffs. And I think this is a realization by the the US authorities that if those tariffs went through, particularly in line with the original announced figures, the absolutely astronomical figures that were announced for all the different countries, it would have a massively damaging impact on US businesses and the US economy. And ultimately, unfortunately, it would also have a really negative impact on the global economy because the US is the biggest economy in the world. And what happens in the US definitely impacts everybody in the world. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you so much to everybody that's supporting the channel. And one of the things I wanted to say is thank you so much to everyone that's dropping comments below, because I think this is one of the best comment section on the whole of YouTube. Some of those comments are really, really quite interesting and detailed and long. A lot of you have some really great ideas, and quite often, if I'm going through those comments, it will generate thoughts for me for a new video. So thank you if you're a contributor in the comments, really means a lot to me. And also thanks a lot for everyone that's supporting me financially. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, thank you so much for that. And some people have been buying me like 10 coffees in one go. Really generous. Thank you so much. And if you're a long-term supporter, either through Patreon or YouTube membership or Buy Me a Coffee membership, thank you for that long-term support. That really keeps me going. And you know that you get those videos advert-free, and usually I post them earlier than I post onto YouTube, unless it's something that I think is latest news that needs to go out early. But thank you for that long-term support, and here's something to put a smile on your face.